Have you ever noticed someone who walks into a room and changes the energy without saying a single word? They don't announce themselves. They don't demand attention. They don't perform confidence or broadcast their presence through volume or force. They simply arrive, and then, at a certain point, they withdraw, quietly, deliberately, without explanation, and something shifts. The people around them begin to wonder, begin to notice, begin to feel, in a way they cannot quite articulate, the weight of an absence that somehow carries more presence than most people manage with their most forceful attempts at impact. These people are not mysterious by accident. They are not naturally gifted with some supernatural quality of magnetism that the rest of us simply lack. They have learned through experience, through the hard and unglamorous work of genuine inner development, something that most people spend their entire lives without discovering. They have learned that availability is not a virtue, that constant accessibility is not generosity, that the person who is always there, always responsive, always ready to engage with whatever anyone brings to them, is not valued more for that availability. They are valued less, not because the people around them are cruel or ungrateful, but because of something far more fundamental, because the human mind assigns worth according to scarcity, and what is always present, always accessible, always predictable, gradually stops being perceived as something that could be lost. And they have learned the corollary of this, the principle that most people find counterintuitive to the point of disbelief, that the deliberate, conscious withdrawal of your presence and your availability is not a loss of power. It is the acquisition of it. When you stop being reachable at every moment, when you choose, consciously and without apology, to be unavailable, the world around you enters a kind of mild crisis, not a catastrophic one, not one that anyone will necessarily name or acknowledge, but a genuine disruption of the operating assumptions that have been governing your relationships, because those assumptions were built on your predictability. And predictability, it turns out, is the mechanism through which most people exercise control over those around them, not through force, not through manipulation in its obvious forms, but through the comfortable certainty that they know what to expect from you. Remove that certainty, and you remove the control, and what replaces it is something far more interesting: genuine attention, genuine curiosity, and the first stirrings of genuine respect. Carl Jung understood this dynamic with extraordinary depth. His life's work, the mapping of the unconscious, the exploration of what actually drives human behavior beneath the surface of our conscious intentions, gives us a framework for understanding not just why this works, but why it is, in the deepest sense, the path toward becoming fully, authentically, uncontrollably yourself. This is what we are going to explore today. 5 dimensions of the power of strategic withdrawal and what each of them reveals about the kind of person you are capable of becoming when you finally stop making yourself endlessly available to a world that has mistaken your generosity for a resource it is entitled to extract. 1. The cost of predictability, becoming an emotional alarm button. There is a particular role that many people occupy in the social ecosystems around them without ever quite realizing it. It is the role of the person who is always available, always responsive, always there when anyone needs anything, to listen, to advise, to comfort, to validate, to absorb whatever anyone brings and return it, processed and softened and easier to bear. From the inside, this role often feels virtuous. It feels like generosity, like loyalty, like the expression of genuine care, and in its healthiest forms, it can be all of those things. There is nothing inherently wrong with being reliable, with being present for the people you care about, with making yourself available when those you love need you. The problem arises, and it arises with a quiet, accumulative inevitability that most people never notice until significant damage has been done, when availability becomes the primary mode of your existence in relationship, when being there for others becomes so unconditional, so reflexive, so entirely unconstrained by any consideration of your own needs or limits, that you cease to be perceived as a person exercising a choice and begin to be perceived as a resource exercising a function. Carl Jung described the persona, the social mask we construct in response to the expectations of others, as one of the central mechanisms through which the authentic self becomes obscured. And there is no persona more thoroughly constructed from others' expectations than the persona of the person who is always available. This mask is built from the accumulated weight of every time you said yes when you wanted to say no, every time you answered the message immediately when you needed space, every time you showed up, not because you genuinely wanted to, but because the alternative, the disappointment, the disapproval, the possibility of being seen as unreliable or uncaring felt more threatening than your own depletion. And here is the ecological reality of this persona, the one that nature itself demonstrates with unambiguous clarity. What is abundant is not valued. What is scarce is. The rarest elements command the highest price. The most reliably available resources are taken for granted in ways that the unpredictable, intermittently accessible ones never are. When you are always on the shelf, always ready, always responsive, always exactly where people expect you to be, you become, in the perceptual economy of those around you, something like furniture, not unloved, necessarily, not unappreciated in some abstract sense, but not truly valued either, in the way that things are valued when their absence is genuinely felt. You have become, to use the language of this moment, an emotional alarm button, something pressed when there is a need for validation, for comfort, for someone to absorb the overflow of another person's life and return to standby when the need passes. Your availability, which you experienced as generosity, has been converted, without anyone's conscious intention, into a service. And services, however appreciated, are not the same as presences. The first step toward reclaiming something genuine is the recognition of this dynamic clear-eyed, without resentment, but without the softening that makes it easier to avoid acting on. You have been available in ways that have cost you more than you have charged, and the people around you have grown accustomed to a price point they were never meant to be paying. That price point is about to change. 2. Conscious silence, a strategic display of power. Let us be precise about what we mean when we talk about becoming unreachable, because the concept is frequently misunderstood in ways that make it seem either more dramatic or more passive than it actually is. Becoming strategically unreachable is not withdrawal from life. It is not the construction of walls, the severing of connections, the retreat into isolation or bitterness, or the performance of wounded dignity. It is not the silent treatment deployed as punishment, not the deliberately created absence designed to make someone feel the weight of what they are losing. These things, dramatic, reactive, emotion-driven, are actually the opposite of what we are describing. They are forms of engagement, just engagement conducted through absence rather than presence. They are still organized around the other person's reaction, still dependent on their noticing, still fundamentally oriented outward rather than inward. What we are describing is something entirely different. It is the simple, quiet, entirely self-referential practice of choosing yourself first before the reflex of availability kicks in, before the familiar anxiety about others' approval has time to override your own genuine assessment of what you need. It is the pause before the response, the breath before the yes, the moment in which you ask, not as performance, not as strategy, but as genuine self-inquiry, whether this is actually how you want to spend your time and energy right now. And then, when the honest answer is no, the willingness to act on that answer, without the elaborate justification and apologetic explanation that the old patterns would have demanded. Jung understood this quality of conscious silence as among the most fertile ground available for genuine inner development, not because silence is inherently valuable since, for its own sake, is merely absence, but because the specific silence that comes from choosing yourself over the reflexive fulfillment of others' expectations creates a quality of inner space that active engagement, by its nature, cannot provide. When you are in the game, when you are responding, engaging, managing others' impressions and expectations and emotional states, you are, of necessity, oriented outward. Your attention is on the other person, on the dynamic between you, on the continuous management of something that is happening outside of you. This is not without value, but it is also not the condition in which you can see most clearly what is actually happening. When you step back, when you take your seat in what Jung might have called the observer's position, something becomes visible that was invisible while you were in the middle of it. The patterns that govern the interaction, the roles you have been unconsciously playing, the manipulations, subtle or not so subtle, that were only possible because you were too close to them to perceive them as what they were. The eagle sees from altitude what the creature on the ground cannot. This is not a metaphor about superiority. It is a metaphor about perspective and strategic silence. The deliberate, conscious choice to withdraw from engagement long enough to see clearly gives you that altitude, not permanently, not as a way of life, but as a practice, a regular return to yourself that makes everything you return to more visible, more intelligible, more navigable. And there is a secondary effect that Jung's framework illuminates clearly. When you stop explaining yourself, when you withdraw the constant stream of justification and context and apology that has been providing those around you with the raw material for their management of you, they lose something they did not know they were depending on. They lose the narrative, they lose the map, and the disorientation that follows is not, ultimately, about you. It is about their own relationship to control and the discovery that it was less solid than they had assumed. 3. Breaking the chains of projection and manipulation. Manipulation, in its most effective forms, does not announce itself. It does not arrive with obvious hostility or transparent self-interest. It arrives through something far more subtle and far more difficult to defend against the precise identification and deployment of your emotional vulnerabilities. Jung called the mechanism at work here projection, the unconscious process by which people attribute to others the contents of their own inner world, including the darkest and least acknowledged parts of it. The person who carries unacknowledged shame will project worthlessness onto those around them. The person who carries unexpressed aggression will project threat onto others. The person who has denied their own neediness will project neediness onto others and respond to it with contempt. In the context of manipulation, this mechanism operates with particular efficiency. The manipulative person, whether or not they are conscious of what they are doing, has learned to identify the specific emotional buttons that produce the responses they are looking for. The fear of abandonment that makes you agreeable. The need for approval that makes you compliant. The guilt at disappointing others that makes you say yes when everything in you wants to say no. These buttons are not random. They are, in every case, connected to something real in your own emotional history, wounds, needs, conditioning that has been with you so long it feels like personality rather than pattern. And here is the central insight. As long as you remain predictably reactive, as long as pressing the button reliably produces the expected response, you are not in control of the dynamic. The button is. The person who knows where the button is. The moment you stop reacting, not through suppression, not through the performance of indifference, but through genuine inner disengagement from the outcome they are trying to produce, the dynamic breaks. Not dramatically, necessarily, but at its structural foundation, because the manipulation requires your participation to complete itself. It is a circuit that needs both poles to function. When one pole withdraws quietly, without fanfare, without explanation, the circuit opens and the current stops flowing. Jung described what happens to the false self-image, the mask of agreeableness and compliance, that you have been wearing, not because it represents who you are, but because it was what was required of you as its dissolution. When you withdraw the expected response, the mask you are being required to wear stops fitting the situation. It falls away, not because you tore it off in a dramatic gesture of refusal, but simply because the conditions that required it are no longer present. What is left, when that mask falls, is something that can be disorienting for everyone involved, including you, because underneath the mask of the person who was always available, always agreeable, always responsive to what others needed, there is someone who has needs and preferences and boundaries of their own. Someone who has been there the whole time, waiting with considerable patience for the performance to end. The world around you will not immediately welcome this person. Some of the people who were most invested in the masked version, who relied on it most heavily, who benefited most directly from your compliance, will respond to its dissolution with something that looks like anger or hurt, but is underneath something simpler. The frustration of someone who has lost access to a resource they were accustomed to treating as their own. This response is not evidence that you have done something wrong. It is evidence that what you were providing was being taken rather than received. And it is, in its way, one of the clearest confirmations available that the dissolution was necessary. For the earthquake of change, the accusation of "you've changed," there is a moment that arrives, reliably and often painfully, in the life of anyone who begins the genuine work of becoming themselves. It arrives in the form of a specific accusation, delivered sometimes with sadness, sometimes with anger, sometimes with a particular quality of wounded confusion that makes it most difficult to withstand. "You've changed," or in its more pointed forms, "You're not the person I knew. You've become selfish. You used to be so different. I don't recognize you anymore." These words are designed, consciously or not, to produce a specific effect, the reinstatement of the previous dynamic. They are an appeal to a version of you that was more manageable, more predictable, more aligned with what the speaker needed from you, and they carry within them an implicit claim that the change you have undergone is a deterioration, that the person you were available, compliant, organized around others' needs was better than the person you were becoming. It is worth examining this claim with complete honesty, because it contains a grain of genuine truth alongside its significant distortion. You have changed. The accusation is factually accurate. You are no longer the same person you were when you were always available, always explaining yourself, always organizing your behavior around the management of others' comfort. That person has shifted, is shifting, will continue to shift as the work deepens, but the question is not whether you have changed. The question is what the change represents. And here is where the distortion in the accusation becomes visible. When someone says, "You've changed," in the context of your having set limits on your availability, what they are actually saying, stripped of its emotional charge and examined for its content, is this: "You are no longer useful to me in the way you used to be." The grief in their voice, the hurt in their words, the accusation of selfishness, these are real emotions, but the object of those emotions is not the loss of you, it is the loss of the function you served. Jung understood this dynamic as one of the most important tests of genuine individuation, because the pressure to return to the previous, more predictable, more comfortable version of yourself is real and often intense. The guilt that accompanies the perception that you have disappointed someone is real. The anxiety that comes with being seen as selfish or uncaring or changed in ways that others disapprove of is real. What makes it possible to withstand this pressure is the recognition of what it actually represents. It is not the voice of genuine concern for your well-being. It is the voice of a system that was organized around your compliance, expressing its distress at the disruption of that organization. It is the sound of an old order protesting its own dissolution. This is not to say that everyone who expresses hurt at your changing is manipulative or acting in bad faith. People are complex, and the feelings are genuine even when their source is the loss of a dynamic rather than the loss of you. But the appropriate response to genuine feelings expressed in the service of an unjust demand is not compliance. It is compassion without capitulation. You can acknowledge their pain without reinstating what they are asking you to reinstate. You can hold space for the complexity of what they are feeling without allowing that feeling to determine what you do next. This is not cruelty. It is the practice of what Jung would have recognized as genuine care, the kind that respects both people enough to refuse the comfort of the old pattern in favor of the difficulty of something more honest, that the guilt you feel at the beginning of this process, the sense that you are somehow violating an obligation, that you are being selfish in a way that is not acceptable, is not evidence that you are doing something wrong. It is evidence that you are dismantling something that has been in place for a long time, something that had structural consequences for everyone involved. That dismantling will produce discomfort. The discomfort is the process, not the problem. 5. Individuation, the return to your own inner temple. We arrive now at the deepest layer of everything we have been exploring, the dimension that gives all of the other principles their ultimate meaning and their ultimate justification. Because everything we have discussed today, the withdrawal of availability, the cultivation of strategic silence, the breaking of manipulation patterns, the willingness to withstand the accusation of change, all of it is in service of something that Jung considered the central project of human psychological life. He called it individuation, the lifelong process of becoming fully, authentically, completely the specific individual that you actually are, not who you were trained to be, not who others need you to be, not who the accumulated expectations of your history have shaped you to perform, but who you are at the most fundamental level of your own nature, beneath all of the conditioning and the compliance and the unconscious adaptation to what the world required of you. Individuation is not a destination. It is not a state you arrive at and then maintain. It is a direction, a sustained, often difficult, frequently disorienting orientation toward the genuine self, maintained in the face of all the forces internal and external that would prefer you to remain manageable, predictable, and organized around their needs. Every genuine individuation process involves, at some point, a form of necessary solitude, not the solitude of isolation, not the retreat from all human connection into a private world of self-sufficiency, but the solitude of genuine interiority, the capacity to be alone with yourself in a way that is productive rather than merely lonely, the capacity to turn inward, not as escape from the outer world, but as contact with the inner one, and to find there something worth developing, worth protecting, worth organizing your life around. When you say no to the outer world, when you decline the invitation, withdraw the availability, refuse the demand, you are, in the language of individuation, saying yes to something else, to the inner voice that has been trying to speak beneath the noise of constant obligation, to the values and desires and genuine preferences that have been waiting, with considerable patience, for a space in which to become audible, to the self that has been present all along but that has had no room to be, because every available room was occupied by what others needed. The sacred solitude that becomes available when you stop waiting at the edge of everyone else's life, when you stop organizing your existence around who might need you next, and what they might need is not emptiness. It is, in Jung's understanding, the condition for the most significant forms of inner development available to a human being. It is the space in which genuine creativity becomes possible, in which genuine self-knowledge becomes accessible, in which the deepest layer of the self, what Jung called the self with a capital S, the totality of the psyche, begins to make itself known. This journey will cost you something. It is worth being honest about this, because the romanticism that sometimes surrounds the idea of individuation can make it sound like a process of pure liberation, the simple shedding of what was constraining in favor of what was always waiting underneath. But genuine individuation involves loss, real loss, not just the shedding of what was never truly yours. Some of the people in your life will not be able to accompany you through this transformation, not because they are bad people, and not because the relationships were without genuine value, but because those relationships were structured in ways that were invisible while you were inside them, around a version of you that is no longer operative. The relationships that were organized around your compliance, your predictability, your always availableness will not survive the dissolution of those qualities. They were not relationships with you. They were relationships with the function you served. And when the function is withdrawn, what remains, if anything remains, will reveal whether there was ever genuine connection beneath the functional arrangement. What you will find on the other side of those losses, and this is not consolation, it is the actual experience of those who have walked this path, is something that the previous relationships, for all their warmth and familiarity, could not provide. You will find people who are capable of genuine encounter, who are interested not in the function you serve, but in the actual person you are, who are themselves engaged in their own versions of this same process, and who recognize in you someone doing the same work. The quality of connection that becomes possible between two people who are each genuinely, honestly, imperfectly themselves, that quality is simply not available between two people who are each performing a carefully maintained role. You will find clarity, the kind that comes from no longer spending enormous amounts of cognitive and emotional energy on the management of others' expectations, energy that is now available for perception, for genuine thought, for the kind of sustained attention to your own inner life that genuine development requires. And you will find, perhaps most surprisingly, peace. Not the peace of having resolved everything. The inner work is never finished, and the person who has truly understood Jung knows better than to expect a final arrival, but the peace of orientation, the deep, quiet, unshakable sense of moving in the right direction, not toward someone else's definition of success or correctness or value, but toward the fullest possible expression of who you actually, genuinely, irreducibly are. We have traveled far today, through the recognition of what predictability costs, through the cultivation of conscious silence, through the breaking of manipulation's hold, through the earthquake of genuine change, and into the deepest territory of all, the return to yourself. Everything we have discussed resolves, ultimately, into a single principle, the principle that Jung spent his life demonstrating, that the greatest explorers of the inner life in every tradition have arrived at independently, that your own experience, if you look at it honestly, has been trying to teach you all along. You cannot truly give what you have not first secured within yourself. You cannot truly connect with another person from a place of self-abandonment. You cannot be genuinely present in your relationships while you are continuously absent from yourself. The work of becoming available to yourself, of withdrawing from the performance of availability in order to cultivate genuine inner presence, is not selfishness. It is the prerequisite for everything worth offering. The person who has done this work, who has sat in the sacred solitude, who has withstood the accusation of change, who has withdrawn from the manipulation and let the old masks fall, that person is not less available to others. They are available in a different way, a way that has substance behind it, a way that comes from genuine choice rather than compulsion. a way that offers something real rather than something reflexive. That quality of presence, chosen, genuine, grounded in actual selfhood rather than performed in response to others' needs, is what genuine connection is made of. It cannot be faked. It cannot be manufactured from the outside in. It can only be grown, quietly, in the interior space that you create when you finally, deliberately, without apology, choose yourself. Some people will not understand this choice. Some will call it coldness. Some will call it selfishness. Some will call it change, in the accusatory tone that makes change sound like loss. They are right that it is change. They are wrong that it is loss. That is the most important thing you can do, and it begins the moment you decide, truly decide, not as a concept, but as a commitment that you are worth the space. You require to become fully yourself. Withdraw, become, and let what is real find its way to what is real in you.